What if I told you that pop stars are now using novel writing frameworks to build their albums? In fact, that's exactly what Ariana Grande did with Eternal Sunshine. And she didn't just kind of structure it. She used Save the Cat, a storytelling method most writers know, but almost no one expected to hear, mapped across an entire pop album. So whether you are a songwriter, a novelist, or just someone who loves great stories, what Ariana Grande pulled off here will shift how you think about storytelling. But here's the real question. If pop stars are now leveling up their storytelling games, what does that mean for novelists still clinging to the basics? In this video, I'll show you how Ariana Grande used Save the Cat not just as a loose reference, but with surgical precision. Every story beat is there, right down to the exact timing the framework prescribes. And once you see it, it's impossible to deny. And if by the end you feel a sudden sense of panic about your own story, don't worry, that feeling is real because it means you're seeing the truth. Save the Cat didn't fail you, it just got outgrown. And when a framework becomes mainstream like this, it stops setting you apart. The game has changed and writers need to level up too. But there is a new, more powerful way forward, one that can level up your storytelling game and help you craft stories readers will fall in love with. But more on that later. First, let me show you exactly how she did it. By the way, if we haven't met already, hello, I'm Julian. I'm a storytelling and author coach. These days, my day job is helping writers like you not just master the craft, but also build the business behind their books so they can finish their novels, sell more copies, and create a life that they actually love. And on the side, I make YouTube videos like this one, where we dive into storytelling frameworks, revision strategies, and marketing tips to help you turn your book into a thriving author career. And if you've been a friend of the channel for a while, you might have caught the Easter egg in my last video and wondered how we'd end up talking about Ariana Grande. So before we dive in, let me just quickly clarify who this video is really for. If you're an aspiring or indie author, this isn't just going to be a refresher on Save the Cat. It is that, but it's also a wake-up call for why that framework alone is no longer enough for you to make your novel stand out. If you're a songwriter, this will show you how artists like Ariana Grande are using storytelling to craft albums that feel like a complete narrative experience. And if you're neither of the above, just a hardcore Ariana fan, then you're about to uncover a whole new layer of meaning in Eternal Sunshine that you've probably never noticed before, and you're very welcome. And hey, if you enjoy this kind of breakdown, I might do more of them in the future, so if there is a music album that you'd love me to take apart from a storytelling perspective, then let me know in the comments. Now, most of you will already be familiar with Save the Cat, but if you're not, here's a quick recap. And if you do know it, then feel free to skip ahead. So Save the Cat is a story structure method originally created for screenwriters and later adapted for novelists. It breaks stories into 3 parts: Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Each act is further divided into 15 beats or plot points. Now, why is it called Save the Cat? The name comes from a storytelling tip. If your protagonist starts off somewhat unlikable, they should save a cat early in the story. Not necessarily a real cat, but some small, redeeming action that makes the audience root for them even if they weren't so likable to begin with. According to the methods, each bit isn't just about what happens, but when it happens. Every plot point is meant to appear within a specific percentage range of the total story. And that's where things get interesting, because in the next part of the video, we'll break down what those beats are, where they fall in the structure, and how Ariana Grande applied them to the storytelling of Eternal Sunshine. Now, let's start with the first part. Act 1. But before we dive in, you might have noticed something about the album track list. There aren't 15 tracks like the 15 beats in Save the Cat, but there are 13 tracks. And that's where an important distinction comes in. Some beats are single scene, others are multi-scene, which means that they can span across several scenes, or in this case, several songs. Now, a fair question to ask is, how are we going to track the percentage placement of each beat? We'll treat the total duration of the album, so 35 minutes and 29 seconds, as 100%. Then we'll use each song's timestamps to calculate the progression throughout the album. Alright, so according to Save the Cat, Act 1 clusters the first 5 beats of the story: the opening image, the theme stated, the setup, the catalyst, and the debate. Let's take a closer look at the first 3 because Ariana hits all of them in a single track. Now, according to the author, the opening image, let me just find it. quickly. Where is it? According to the author, the opening image provides a quick before snapshot of your hero and their world, so a glimpse of what to expect in the story. In a novel, this should be the first scene or chapter. It says that it's supposed to help the reader of your story understand exactly what kind of journey they're about to go on and who they're about to go on it with. The opening image has a mirror beat, or an opposite beat, called the final image. And the final image is the very last beat of the story, but we'll get to that later on. And this first beat, it's meant to appear in the very first 1% of your story. Then you have the setup, where you show the rest of the protagonist's world. But more importantly, you reveal how imperfect that world is and what desperately needs fixing. This is also where you usually introduce the A-story characters, the people who exist within the protagonist's status quo world. And they're called A-story characters because in storytelling, there is this concept called the duality of story. You've got the A-story, so the external sequence of events, what's happening on the surface, and the B-story, so the external journey of the protagonist, what's happening underneath. So in the setup, we meet the A characters, and the B characters, we'll meet them later. As for timing, Save the Cat recommends that the setup takes place between 1% and 10% of your story. Now the third beat, the theme stated, according to the book, it briefly alludes to the transformative journey that your hero will take and the flaw or flaws that they will eventually conquer. In simpler terms, this is your protagonist's need or their core life lesson. This beat usually shows up as a statement or a question that hints at what the protagonist needs to learn by the end of the story. It's what I'd call a beat within a beat because it usually appears during the setup. Save the Cat places the setup between 1 and 10% of the story, but the theme stated tends to fall closer to the 5% mark. I'd say that feels more symbolic than precise, just somewhere in the middle of the setup. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all three of those first beats show up in a single song, the very first track of the album, intro, End of the World. Let's take a look at the first verse. These lines give us the opening image, so the snapshot of a protagonist who's fairly deeply unhappy in their relationship, unsure and questioning the very definition of love. Then the first verse continues and the setup starts to unfold. We get the sense that there's someone else in their life who triggered or at least deepened that questioning. Now, because this is a concept album, meaning that all the songs are connected by a unifying theme, story, or idea, that very first line, "How can I tell if I'm in the right relationship?" is clearly the theme stated. It's the central question that she'll be wrestling with, the one she needs to answer by the end of the story. Now let's look at the percentages. The first song, intro, End of the World, lasts 1 minute and 33 seconds. That's roughly the first 4% of the album. So we've got the opening image and the theme stated landing exactly within that recommended 1 to 5% range. Now, because the setup is meant to cover the first 1 to 10% of the story, let's look at the next track and see if the setup continues there. In the book, it says that the setup is where you'll introduce everyone who exists within your hero's Act 1 status quo world. These can be friends, family, bosses, co-workers, teachers, enemies, fellow students, peers, and so on. Basically anyone who is important when the story begins before your hero's life changes. Alright, so let's have a look at the next track and see who we meet. So yes, clearly the setup continues. We meet her friend Courtney, although without the full context, it's not totally clear why she pulled up. And that's because this song also contains the next beat, the catalyst. According to Save the Cat, the catalyst is an inciting incident or life-changing event that happens to the hero, which will catapult them into a new world or new way of thinking. An action beat that should be big enough to prevent the hero from being able to return to their status quo setup world. In this case, the song Bye depicts the protagonist leaving her husband, which is exactly the kind of life-changing event that kicks off the rest of the story. To quote Save the Cat again, the catalyst is essentially a wake-up call. Now, you could argue that the catalyst was that interaction 5 weeks ago, the one that she can't stop thinking about, but in terms of the album structure, this song, Bye, clearly carries the second half of the setup and the catalyst. Now let's take the percentages. The catalyst typically appears around the 10% mark, right at the transition between the setup and the next beat. The song by is 2 minutes and 45 seconds long, and it spans from 4 to 12% of the album, which quite frankly is a perfect window for the setup to wrap up and the catalyst to land. Now, for every action, there's a reaction, and for every catalyst, there's a debate. The debate is the final beat of Act 1. It shows us how resistant the protagonist is to change, or how reluctant they are to face what needs to change. Interestingly, Save the Cat describes it as a reaction beat, and it usually comes in the form of a question, like, what do I do? Should I go? Should I stay? Or will I survive? What happened next? The debate is the time in your story for your hero to take a step back and decide how they're going to proceed after this life-altering catalyst has knocked them down. Now let's look at the next track, and just starting with the title, Don't Wanna Break Up Again, it already signals hesitation, reflection, and that emotional step back. In the pre-chorus, she sings, and then in the chorus, so the inner debate is pretty clear. And as Ariana Grande said in an interview,
they are coupled in an interesting way, because it's kind of like Don't Wanna Break Up Again is kind of like the hangover of Bye in a way.
So those are the beats of Act 1. At this point, she's questioning pretty much everything. She's left someone behind, but isn't sure yet whether she's moving forward or running away. Now let's move into Act 2. According to Save the Cat, Act 2 includes the next 7 beats of the story. The break into 2, fun and games, the B story, the midpoint, the bad guys close in, the all is lost moment, and the dark night of the soul. The break into 2 is the moment the hero decides to accept the call to action, leave their comfort zone, try something new, or venture into a new world or new way of thinking. It's a decisive action beat that separates the status quo world of Act 1 from the new upside-down world of Act 2. Alright, so technically the next song should be the break into 2. And not so surprisingly, this is exactly where Ariana Grande placed the album's interlude, Saturn Return interlude. Here's what she has to say about the interlude.
And then there's this change, this shift, sonically too, to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But there's still disco elements that come through the rest of the album. Why was that moment the right place for an interlude, a shift?
I think it just sort of, Saturn, Eternal Sunshine feels like a wake-up moment, sort of like a pivotal moment in the story. And the Saturn Returns coming right before it, just kind of with the wake up, it tells you to wake up. I don't know, it just felt like setting up the rest of the album in a way.
Now let's look at the lyrics. Now, the break into 2 is supposed to happen between 20 and 22% of the story. And if we check the track list, Saturn Returns interlude lands, I kid you not, exactly between 20 and 22%. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Alright, let's keep going and look at the next 2 beats, the Fun and Games and the B story. The Fun and Games is a multi-scene beat, and the B story is a beat that usually unfolds within it. So let's see if and how the next 2 songs line up with that structure. According to Save the Cat, the Fun and Games beat is probably the reason your reader picked up this book in the first place. It's also called the promise of the premise, because when a reader starts reading a book, they were most likely told something about this particular beat. And funny enough, the next track is called Eternal Sunshine, which is also the name of the album. So that already ticks the box. Then we get Supernatural, which dives into her new love story, the one that stirred a lot of controversy. So these 2 songs together clearly deliver on the album's promise, both emotionally and thematically. Now let's look at the percentages. The Fun and Games is supposed to span from 20 to 50% of the story. Since it is a multi-scene beat, we'll look at both tracks together. Eternal Sunshine runs 3 minutes and 31 seconds. Supernatural is 2 minutes and 44 seconds, which puts this section of the album between 22 and 40%. pretty damn close. Now, what about the B story? The B story is the introduction of a new character or characters who will ultimately serve to help the hero learn the theme. This can be a love interest, a nemesis, a mentor, a family member, or a friend. I'll let you guess which one it is. Of course, this whole concept album is about figuring out whether or not we're in the right relationship, so it makes perfect sense that the B story character would be the new romantic partner. According to Save the Cat, this character should be introduced right around the 22% mark, and that lines up perfectly with the track Eternal Sunshine. Let's look at the lyrics. Now, you could argue that the love interest was already hinted at back in the first song, but there it was just a passing thought, a maybe. Here it's clear and concrete. This is the moment he enters the story fully. Now, here's something else that's interesting. The author of Save the Cat describes Act 2 as the part where the protagonist starts trying to fix things, but in the wrong way. And the track Eternal Sunshine, it's a direct reference to the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where the main character tries to erase the memory of his past relationship to avoid pain. And that same impulse shows up in the lyrics. That desire to forget, to move on by erasing the past, is exactly what Save the Cat would call the wrong way to deal with inner transformation. Now, if we zoom out and go back to the fun and games beats, the author of Save the Cat explains that this is where we see the hero in their new world. They're either loving it or hating it, succeeding or floundering. And that distinction matters because it will directly impact the next two beats, but we'll get to those in a moment. But before we decide whether Ariana's protagonist is loving it or floundering, let's look at the visuals she chose for the lyrics visualizers on YouTube. You'll notice that there are two different colors, one bright with a smile and the other darker, more introspective, maybe even sad. And I don't think that's random. I believe that those visuals were chosen intentionally to reflect the emotional arc of the album. So if we look specifically at the track Eternal Sunshine, it is paired with the darker cover, which according to Save the Cat would suggest that the protagonist is floundering in this new world. Now let's see if that tracks with what comes next in the Save the Cat structure. So the next bit is the midpoint. According to Save the Cat, the midpoint is literally the middle of the novel, where the fun and games culminates in either a false victory, so the hero has thus far been succeeding, or a false defeat, so the hero has thus far been floundering. Something should happen here to raise the stakes and push the hero toward real change. So what exactly do they mean by false victory and false defeat? A false victory is when things appear to be going well for the protagonist, but since we're only halfway through, it clearly can't be the real win. Otherwise, the story would just end at the midpoint. And for the same reason, a false defeat isn't the end either. It might feel like a major loss, but there's still more story and growth to come. So now, if we look at the track list, the next song, True Story, should mark the midpoint. And since we already established that the protagonist was floundering during the fun and games beat, this track should represent a false defeat. At this point of the story, she has left her husband, started a new relationship, and things seem to be getting better on the surface, but public pressure is creeping in and it's starting to chip away at her sense of stability. The lyrics are clearly darker. They paint a picture of a protagonist whose public image is unraveling and whose new relationship is now becoming a source of pain rather than escape. And if you remember how brutal the internet was during that time, with people calling Ariana a homewrecker, demonizing her, it kind of makes sense at this point in the album that the battle for truth, for her own truth, feels lost. Now, structurally, the midpoint should hit right around the 50% mark, and True Story spans from 40 to 48% of the album. So by the end of the song, we're pretty much right there. Okay, now onto the next beat, and this one is a multi-scene beat, which in our case is a multi-song beat. The bad guy closing. If we go back to the book, Save the Cat says if the midpoint was a false victory, the section will be a downward path where things get progressively worse for the hero. If the midpoint was a false defeat, this section will be an upward path where things seem to get progressively better for the hero. But regardless of path, the hero's deep-rooted flaws or internal bad guys are closing in. Well, we established that the previous track was a false defeat, so the next few songs should show things appearing to get better for her. For this beat, we'll look at the next 3 songs, so The Boy Is Mine, Yes and We Can't Be Friends, Wait For Your Love. Let's break them down. The Boy Is Mine echoes the empowerment that we saw back in the Fun and Games beat, especially in Supernatural. She's owning her desire, her power, her connection, with lyrics like Then we move into Yes and, an unapologetic moment of rising above the criticism. This track is widely seen as her response to media backlash, and in the music video, she literally performs in front of a panel of critics.
So I think Yes and is the right thing to just say, hey, we're all experiencing the same kind of journey in a different way, on a different level, on a different this. And I liked it because it's also just expressing a whole bunch of feelings that I've had for the past forever of my career. There's always been a conversation about my body, my face, my hair, my voice, my everything. And it's like, if you change it and correct it, then it's wrong again for different reasons. It's like, all right, I'm done. It's done. I'm just gonna be.
So within the story of Eternal Sunshine, the bad guys are no longer just internal, they're public. She knows she'll be criticized either way and she performs anyway. And then we get to We Can't Be Friends, Wait For Your Love. This one is pretty layered. At first listen, I thought that she was addressing her former husband about leaving, about her new relationship, because the first verse reads like this. And these lyrics, to be fair, they track with the title We Can't Be Friends. But then there's a part in brackets, Wait For Your Love, which kind of threw me off a little bit, because why would she be waiting for his love, unless it's platonic? Then something else in the lyrics stood out. That's when I realized the song had a hidden meaning, which again, as a storytelling coach, I live for this kind of thing. And when you connect it with the previous track, Yes and, which was about all the critics, this line suddenly feels like it's directed at them. So yes, we're clearly still in the bad guys closing beat, and it makes sense that this song is addressed not to her ex-husband, but to the real villain of the story. The media, the critics, the people who fed a monstrous fire just for attention or money, and it's right there in the lyrics. This is where the character's external world starts looking better, but underneath it, the emotional tension is still growing. Now, according to Save the Cat, this beat, so the bad guys closing, should happen between 50 and 75% of your story. In the case of Eternal Sunshine, these 3 tracks combined span 48 to 76%. I mean, at this point, I just raise my case. Just kidding, we've got a couple more songs to go. Alright, so according to Save the Cat, the final 2 beats of Act 2 are the All Is Lost moment and the Dark Night of the Soul. The All Is Lost moment is the lowest point of the novel, an action beat where something happens to the hero that, combined with the internal bad guys, pushes the hero to rock bottom, and this should hit at the 75% mark. Then comes the Dark Night of the Soul, a reaction beat where the protagonist takes time to process everything that's happened thus far. The protagonist should be worse off than at the start of the story. And that beat usually spans from 75 to 80%. And the next song, I Wish I Hated You, it's both the All Is Lost moment and the Dark Night of the Soul rolled into one. Ariana even said that this is the one song from the album that she probably won't perform live. And considering that no one wants to relive their darkest hour, that makes total sense.
There's a song that I sounded like you were crying while recording it.
Probably was.
What does that song mean to you?
It's one of those that I'm so glad that feeling is captured on this album, but it's one that I won't listen to probably or sing live probably. But I think it's like a very important color to exist within the album because it's just an important piece of the puzzle to me.
We'll look at the lyrics in a second, but here's the most interesting part about the dark night of the soul. According to Save the Cat, this is also the one bit in the novel where the protagonist is allowed to move backward instead of forward. I call it the return to the familiar. If possible, take your protagonist back to where they started. Reunite them with an old friend, get them back together with an ex. I don't see that happening. Give them their old job back, somehow returns them to their original status quo Act 1 life. Because when you're wallowing and feeling lost, it's only natural that you'd start searching for something familiar and safe. But here's the clincher. It doesn't feel familiar and safe anymore. And it certainly doesn't feel the same. They feel like a complete stranger in a place that only felt familiar. This points out to the hero and the reader that they don't belong there anymore, that they can't go back to the way things were. Now let's see if Ariana followed the Save the Cat advice and brought the protagonist back to where she started. At this point, there are just too many coincidences. But anyway, we're back to the same physical space from Act 1, but now nothing feels the same. And emotionally, she's clearly processing everything that's been happening so far. And once again, the percentage match is eerily perfect. This beat should fall between 75 and 80% of the story, and the song I Wish I Hated You spans from 76 to 84% of the album. And that concludes Act 2. She's tried to move on, she started something new, but it hasn't brought the clarity she hoped for, and now the only way forward is to confront herself. Now let's dive into the third and final act and see if it tracks all the way to the end. According to Save the Cat, Act 3 includes the 3 final beats: the break into 3, the finale, and the final image. The break into 3 is meant to bring the hero into the synthesis world of Act 3, where they will finally fix things the right way. So what exactly is the synthesis world? It is who the protagonist was in Act 1 plus what they've learned in Act 2. And interestingly, the author also writes that the break into 3 almost always includes the following realization for the hero: it was never them who had to change, it was always me. So let's look at the next track and see if that's the case. In this chorus, we finally see self-awareness. She's acknowledging her flaws, owning them, and unlike earlier in the album, she's no longer trying to fix or change the person that she's with to be happy. If you remember what she said earlier in track 5, back then there were still blame, still frustrations. But now she realizes that being imperfect is not a flaw, it's her strength, it's exactly why she's able to love someone the way they need to be loved. According to Save the Cat, the break into 3 should happen around the 80% mark, and the track Imperfect for You hits at 84%. Not too far off. And so naturally we arrive at the last song of the album, the one that represents both the finale and the final image. Interestingly, this track has 2 distinct parts: the main song and an audio recording of her Nona. So maybe, just maybe, this first part is the finale and the second part is the final image. But let's take a closer look at what they are. According to Save the Cat, the finale is when the protagonist proves that they have truly learned the theme and enacts the plan they came up with in the break into 3. Bad guys are destroyed, flaws are conquered, lovers are reunited. Not only is the protagonist's world saved, but it's a better place than it was before. So let's look at the lyrics. Clearly, her world is now a better place. She's no longer in emotional turmoil. She's finally in a happy, healthy relationship. Now, let's look at the final image. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is the mirror beat of the opening image. And at the start of the album, she opened with this question. Now, let's hear what her Nona says in the final voice recording. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty damn good answer to a question that most of us have asked ourselves at least once in our lives. And that's why this album hits so hard. It's not just storytelling, it's personal. And honestly, your novel should be too. Because if even pop stars are using Save the Cat to shape emotional narratives, then as writers, we simply cannot stop there. Structure might get you started, but it won't get your story remembered. If you want to go deeper into the real mechanics of themes, transformation, and character-driven storytelling, I've got a free course on storytelling that walks you through the frameworks that I personally use with my own coaching clients. You can watch it by clicking right here, and if you made it all the way to the end, then drop a cat emoji in the comments so that I know that you're one of the real ones. I hope you enjoyed the video. I definitely had a blast making it, and I hope that came through. I'm Julian Maylet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.